Late summer feels like the finish line, and most gardeners mentally check out right when their decisions matter most. What you do in these final weeks determines how good your garden looks this fall and how much you'll spend next spring. Before you walk away from your flower garden for the rest of the summer, there are 7 things you should be doing right now, because what you do in these last few weeks doesn't just decide how your garden looks this fall. It decides how much time and money you're going to spend next spring. One of these takes less than 5 minutes. One of them can save you real money on plants next year. And the last one is something almost nobody thinks to do, but it might be the single thing that changes how your whole garden looks next season. Late summer isn't the end of your garden. It's your chance to build the garden you're actually going to love next year. Let's get into it. But before we dive in, if you want your garden looking its absolute best through every season, make sure you like this video, subscribe to My Garden Blooms, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next gardening tips. Most gardeners treat late summer like the season is basically over, flowers are fading, the excitement's gone, and it's tempting to just let everything ride until frost. But here's the thing. Experienced gardeners know that beginners usually don't. This is actually one of the most useful stretches of the entire year. This is when you clean up strategically, get ahead of problems before they get worse, prepare space for what's coming next, save a few plants from dying with the season, and make decisions while you can still remember what actually worked. Because right now, your garden is basically handing you a report card. It's showing you exactly which plants earned their spot, which ones got out of control, which ones quietly disappointed you, and where there's empty space you didn't even notice until this moment. So let's start where your eyes probably go first. 1. Deadhead the right flowers. Deadheading, removing spent flowers, still matters this late in the season, and it does 2 things at once. It instantly cleans up the look of your bed, and for a lot of repeat blooming flowers, it tells the plant to stop putting energy into seed production and put that energy into more flowers instead. The technique is simple. You're not just plucking the flower head off, you're cutting back to just above a healthy leaf node or a set of leaves, so the plant has somewhere clean to push new growth from. But here's where this gets interesting, because deadheading isn't a blanket rule you apply to everything in the bed. Some flowers you actually want to leave alone. Plants that produce interesting seed heads can add texture through fall and winter, and a lot of those same seed heads feed birds through the colder months. So before you start snipping everything that's fading, ask yourself what you actually want out of that plant: more blooms, or a second act as a seed head, or a food source for wildlife. A simple beginner tip: if a flower is one that reliably reblooms when deadheaded, cut it back promptly. If you're not sure, leave a few spent blooms on one plant and see what happens. You'll learn more about your own garden that way than from any guide. But flowers aren't the only thing you should be watching right now. There's something a lot less attractive hiding around the base of your plants, and ignoring it can turn into a much bigger problem later. 2. Remove diseased or damaged foliage. Late summer has a way of exposing problems that were building quietly all season. Leaf spots, mildew, sudden wilting on certain stems. But before you go pulling every discolored leaf off your plants, here's a myth worth busting. Not every brown leaf is a disease. Sometimes a brown leaf is just an old leaf doing exactly what old leaves do at the end of a long, hot summer. What you're actually looking for is different spots that keep spreading rather than staying put. A powdery gray-white coating on the leaf surface, unusual lesions, or a plant that's declining fast and repeatedly, season after season in the same spot. That's the pattern that's actually worth acting on. When you do spot something that looks like a real problem, remove the affected leaves and any obviously infected material that's fallen around the base of the plant, and get it out of the garden rather than tossing it into a home compost pile that may not get hot enough to kill off disease organisms. And if you're moving from a clearly diseased plant to a healthy one, take a second to wipe down your pruning tool. It's a small habit that keeps one problem from turning into three. This is one of those jobs that looks optional until you realize what happens if you ignore it, because good garden sanitation now is often the difference between a small problem this year and a repeat problem next year. And once you've dealt with the trouble on your plants, there's one more problem underneath them that can quietly multiply while you're not looking. 3. Get ahead of the weeds. Here's a line worth remembering. The weeds you ignore now may be the weeds you're fighting all over again next year. Late summer weeds are dangerous for one specific reason. A lot of them are about to flower and set seed. And once that seed drops, you're not dealing with this year's weed problem anymore. You're planting next year's. The good news is that timing does most of the work for you. A weed pulled before it flowers is a solved problem. The same weed pulled after it's dropped seed just means you'll be back here again in a few weeks doing it all over. Depending on what you're dealing with, that might mean hand pulling, hoeing while the soil's workable, or simply mulching bare soil so fewer weed seeds get the light and contact they need to germinate in the first place. And if you're considering an herbicide, it's worth identifying exactly what weed you're dealing with first. Using the wrong product, or spraying too close to the flowers you actually want, can do more harm than the weed itself. And if you think the biggest job in your garden right now is pulling weeds, wait until you see what can happen when your perennials outgrow the space you gave them. 4. Deal with overcrowded perennials. A crowded flower bed isn't necessarily a full flower bed. Sometimes it just looks busy, and underneath that busyness, your plants are actually competing with each other for light, water, and air. The signs are usually easy to spot once you know what to look for. Plants spilling into the walkway, floppy stems that can't hold themselves up anymore, a clump with a dead, hollowed-out center, or neighboring plants that are visibly shading each other out. Now, here's the part a lot of gardening advice gets wrong. Fall isn't automatically the best time to divide everything. It depends entirely on the plant. As a general rule, many spring and early summer blooming perennials can be divided in early fall, while plants that bloom in late summer or fall generally do better divided in spring, so their energy isn't split between healing from division and flowering at the same time. And a handful of perennials, the ones with deep taproots, for example, don't like being disturbed at all and are best just left in place or given more room next season. So your real job right now isn't divide everything. It's figuring out which plants genuinely need dividing, which ones just need to be relocated, which ones need thinning, and which ones simply need more breathing room in next year's layout. But don't do this blindly. If you're not sure how a specific plant responds to division, it's worth a quick check before you start digging. Some plants reward you with more blooms, others punish you with a rough season. Now let's move to a tip that's a little more unexpected, and it's the one that starts actually saving you money. Take cuttings from plants you want to keep. Before the first cold night turns that plant you love into a one-season memory, ask yourself something. Can I make another one from it? A lot of the plants gardeners treat as disposable annuals. Think coleus, geraniums, and begonias aren't actually annuals at all. They're tender perennials that simply can't survive an outdoor winter in most of the U.S. But you don't need to survive the winter outdoors. You just need a small piece of the plant to survive it indoors. The process is straightforward. Take a cutting a few inches long from a healthy, actively growing stem tip, making sure it includes at least 1 or 2 leaf nodes. That's the little bump on the stem where a leaf attaches. and it's where new roots will form. Strip the leaves off the lower half of the cutting, so you're not left with foliage sitting in water or soil where it'll just rot. Depending on the plant, you can root it in a glass of water on a bright windowsill, or straight into a moist rooting medium. Keep it out of direct, harsh sun, keep the water fresh or the soil consistently moist, and give it a few weeks. You'll start to see roots forming, and once they're developed, you've got a brand new plant that costs you nothing but a few minutes. One thing worth being honest about: not every plant roots this easily, and cuttings taken from a stressed, wilted, or diseased plant usually won't succeed, so always take your cutting from your healthiest growth, not your struggling plant hoping it'll magically recover as a clone. But saving plants isn't the only way to save money in this video. The next thing you do can stop you from wasting money on the wrong plants next spring. Here's a small exercise that changes how you see your garden. Stand at the edge of it and look at it like you're seeing it for the very first time. Where's the empty space? Where does it feel like there's too much of one thing? Where does the color completely disappear for weeks at a time? Is there a plant that just looks out of place now that everything's grown in? And where could the garden actually use some height, or a structural plant that holds its shape after everything else fades? Once you've spotted those gaps, don't rush to fill them. Clear only the areas that genuinely need it. You don't need to disturb healthy, established soil just to feel productive. If drainage has been a problem in a certain spot, or the soil's clearly depleted, that's worth addressing. But amending soil that's already doing its job is just extra work for no benefit. Measure the space you actually have. Think about how big these plants will get at maturity, not how big they look in the nursery pot, and plan combinations, instead of grabbing whatever looks pretty when you're standing in a garden center next spring with no plan at all. Doing this now, while the gaps are visually obvious, means you walk into spring already knowing exactly what you need instead of guessing. And now we're at the one step that costs you absolutely nothing, takes almost no time, and might be the most valuable thing you do for next year's garden. Your garden right now is full of information you are going to completely forget by next April. That's not a knock on your memory, it's just how memory works. So the easiest way to improve next year's garden is simply to remember what happened in this one while it's still fresh. Take photos of the combinations you loved. Write down which plants bloomed for months and which ones gave up by July. Mark the spot near the driveway that dried out every single week. Note the bed that looked incredible because 3 plants happened to repeat the same color at the same time, because that wasn't luck. That was a combination worth repeating on purpose. Maybe your coneflowers were the star of the whole season, while something else disappeared without you even noticing. Maybe there's a corner that's just never going to work the way it's currently planted. Write it down now, because in 6 months, you won't remember any of it with this kind of clarity. Start a running list: plants to buy more of, plants to never buy again, spots that need to be redesigned, seeds worth saving from the plants that performed the way you wanted. None of this takes more than a few minutes, and it might be the single highest value thing on this entire list, because it's the one thing that makes every single year of gardening easier than the year before. Quick checklist. So here's what I'd actually do if I walked into my garden this afternoon. First, inspect. Walk the bed and see what's actually going on. Then clean up, deadhead strategically, and clear out anything genuinely diseased. Then prevent problems. Pull the weeds before they go to seed. Then propagate. Take cuttings from anything you're not ready to lose. Then plan. Figure out where fall planting actually makes sense. And then record. Write down what worked and what didn't, while you still remember. Inspect, clean up, prevent, propagate, plan, record. 6 moves, 1 afternoon, and a completely different garden waiting for you next spring. Late summer isn't the end of your flower garden. It's the handoff between this year's garden and next year's, and you don't need to do everything on this list to make that handoff count. Even picking 2 or 3 of these is enough to make next year noticeably easier and noticeably better. If you want practical flower gardening advice that helps you skip the mistakes and keep your garden looking good through every season, this is exactly what My Garden Blooms is here for. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one, where we're going to talk about exactly what to plant right now to get color moving straight into fall. Before you go, which of these 7 are you doing first? And what's one thing in your garden this year you absolutely want to bring back next year? Drop it in the comments. I read every one.